We're going to be looking at the Carolean age that we've just begun. Yeah, I had to look it up, but apparently Carolean is the name for an era of a king called Charles. That's what you use. So,
right, and that's where we're going, is it? Charles III?
Well, King Charles III has already started his reign. We're in the Carolean era.
First day of business today, though.
What is that going to look like with King Charles in business?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm hoping that he will decide that mourning is court mourning as in grieving for people who have died. I hope he will make a decision about who should be mourning, and are people like the BBC and the media allowed not to mourn and put on mournful programmes.
Oh, I see. Do they have to put on mournful programmes all the time, I think?
Well, they did before the Queen was buried, yes, and there have been a large number of complaints about it because there was nothing else but programmes about the Queen. They weren't allowed to put on any entertainment or...
It did rather take over, didn't it?
Yes.
Maybe that's a decision going forward. That, in a way, it's not his decision, is it? It's fascinating as we look at what the Carolean age will look like, though. It's fascinating that, although they didn't have to do that they did.
Well, I think the BBC in particular were trying to get back in the...
back in favour.
Back in favour.
With traditionalists and conservatives with a small c. And it's surprising that there was such an outpouring of grief and that so many people suddenly turned out to be closet monarchists, closet royalists. Who'd have thought?
Well, I don't think they even realised themselves.
Yeah, it was.
Perhaps they were.
Now, I look back on the Victorian age with surprise that as the Queen was grieving, everyone wore black. It seemed that society was changed by her grief.
Yes.
When her husband died. For years she was grieving and in fact stepped back from public life.
Yes.
And the whole of the country...
society didn't do that.
No, but the whole of the country was affected by it.
Yes.
I thought that we'd moved on from that. I'm not saying we should do, I'm just saying I thought we had moved on. But it does seem that, we still see the royal family, at least the monarch themselves, as our leader. Mm-hmm. Because I can't explain the response of the country except by doing that.
No, it's said that he's following his mother very closely. But of course, if we take his previous life, as Prince of Wales in particular, he seemed fairly opposite to his mother. Not dissolute, but taking up causes that she wouldn't have embraced.
What are these differences? Because that's what we're looking at now. What will the new Carolean age look like? How will King Charles III be as king? What do you think, Norman?
I was going back to the BBC. I don't think the BBC was grieving. Yes, all the presenters had to wear black, and anything that was happening around the movement of the Queen's body and the funeral and so on was portrayed on the BBC. The rest of the time, they filled up with reporters going round the country, talking to people about what their reaction was. And I don't think that's grieving. I think that is just seeking interview opportunities to fill slots. And it was persistent. Everybody seemed to be asked. And I questioned why. Good for those people who had an opportunity to say something. But there was just so much of it. Interviews here, interviews there, this person and that person and whatever and so on. And when you go back to the Victorian era, of course, you didn't have that because there wasn't a national television. There wasn't even strong communication between villages.
That does give a very different feel to it. So you do end up with it being able to be the case that you can have like a national reaction because a combined national reaction to events. It's interesting that having responded in that way, not just the BBC, but other forms of media, and it does seem to be, from reports that we see and the people I've spoken to, I can see the reaction of people, that people were grieving when the Queen lost. But then there seems to have been a positive reaction to how the King has handled himself so far. There was the incident with the pen, or two incidents with pens, where he reacted angrily to something.
When he was with the Accession Council.
Yeah, there were two occasions when he was signing documents to do with his accession, and he was annoyed twice. This was seen as him being, high-handed, and
I think he's just acquired his grandfather's temperament.
The general reaction is, if anything, positive. He, like everyone else, gets irritated when things don't go right, especially when he's very tired.
And I imagine he would have been very tired.
He would have been tired physically and emotionally at that point, and yet was having to hold it together. And I think getting a bit irritated about something. He called the pen a stinking pen, I think, at one point, which is hardly the harshest language you could use. So that sort of behaviour, it's a glitch in an otherwise very dignified time. But what will he do next? Now, Beryl, you were just saying that you've seen differences in his style, but also, it seems, in what he believes from the previous queen, from his mother. So what do you think those differences are? What do you think the differences are going to be with this new king?
I think the one difference that I notice is from having studied what he followed previously during his days as the Prince of Wales. He was a great follower of homeopathy.
Yeah.
And
that's true, yeah.
So I can't imagine that he would take very kindly to following the science.
Now, he's gone a different route with homeopathy. I'm not saying it's unscientific. Obviously, there are professionals working in that area, but they're not seeing as the mainstream science, are they? Which is what you're talking about. So are you saying that you think that means he wouldn't have been fooled by this supposed scientific narrative that the government and the Queen was over the pandemic?
I don't know, really, because we don't get told a lot about how he dealt with his own case of COVID.
No, interesting.
That he acquired back in the early days, which meant he had to go into isolation, as did Camilla, of course.
Yeah.
And he was up in Scotland. Did he follow a homeopathic course?
Might have done him a lot of good. Yeah, interesting. And it's interesting that you could see him as a bit of a maverick king, maybe.
Hung on to homeopathy, even though science said to the world it's a whole lot of
bunkum, yes.
Bunkum, yes.
Yes. What do they call the standards? Allopathic medicine is the name of the sort of standard way of treating things. One of the main features of the standard treatment of medicine is you see it as solving a problem. Now, I know there's a whole health industry which is preventative, but in general, when you think of the National Health Service, it's really a national sickness service.
Yes.
I wonder if that's his belief as well. I mean, would he be in favour of more a whole different approach to health? Not having a national sickness service, but having encouragement to live healthier lives so that you don't get ill. I mean, obviously, you always need treatments of people when they do get sick, but the emphasis has been on treating people with drugs.
Yes, I think his lifestyle in the main, as far as I know what it is, has been a healthy one. He believes in exercise.
Yeah.
He's done a lot of horse riding.
Skiing, off-piste skiing.
Yes. Well, that's dangerous.
Well, one of his close friends died, of course, doing it back in the day. That's interesting. Now, the other differences, I would say, could be differences with the Queen, was he was very interested in preventing pollution, wasn't he? Right from the early days. I mean, I think in the 70s he was talking about non-degradable plastics being thrown into the ocean. He was way ahead of his time. And yet, aesthetically, certainly, he's a traditionalist. I mean, there's his famous comment about the carbuncle in the architecture.
In architecture.
Yes.
Architectural design.
Yes. Modern buildings are carbuncles on the face of the city. Very traditionalist in design.
Yes.
Now, before we go any further, I just want to say, on all these points that you've raised, I agree with him. He's way ahead, certainly on the pollution side, because he was back in the 70s, and I was only 5 years old at the start of the 70s. Mm-hmm. But certainly he's ahead of his time, just generally in that area. So he's against pollution, and you need degradable products so that you can help the planet. Mm-hmm. He's for alternative forms of medicine instead of still just giving drugs to people. Is a healthy lifestyle.
Believes in writing spidery letters.
The spider memo idea was because of his handwriting, as you say. But I think he just fires off memos to people when he's annoyed, doesn't he? I think that's what they say.
Yes.
Hence, I suppose, the spidery writing. But I think that you should do that. I mean, you should be able to say, asking, well, this is not right, this is right, and be able to give your opinion not taking sides in political matters, though. So maybe we're going to get a very different sort of monarch. What are you thinking, Norman?
I'd like to pick up the architecture one, because I think he was right.
Yeah.
I think that the use of traditional materials, when we were down south, we often used to drive out of Dorchester towards Exeter, and there was Poundbury, wasn't it, which was a town that Charles sort of designed, and it was all traditional materials. And when you think about what this country hasn't really sorted out properly with the Grenfell Tower and all the consequences from that, all of the buildings which cladding has been stripped from because they're proving to be unsafe. Everywhere was plastic cladding, as opposed to the solid materials of Portland stone, good brick. It's still going on. You shove up concrete and stick cladding on the outside. Yeah. And he is quite right. Going back to traditional materials is something that we've got to do, because we haven't yet sorted out the consequences of all of the other stuff.
Mm.
Yes, but we're talking about surface adornment. I quite agree with using traditional materials like stone, but traditional design also involves a sort of intricate design, which I don't exactly see the purpose of. I am one for modern design because it's clean, and it doesn't have to be cleaned like traditional Ionian and Corinthian pillars.
That is true. Having churches that have been in these older designs, they do get dirty. And of course, because they have lots of different surfaces, mouldings, and they can be damaged. And when they're damaged, it looks bad.
Yes.
I'm with him on even on the aesthetic. I prefer the look of older buildings. One of my churches, St Paul's in Seacombe, was built in the 19th century, as pretty much all the churches around were. In fact, most of the buildings were, because it was the shipbuilding industry that caused people to move there. There were just tiny shipping villages before that. So almost everything was built from the 19th century onwards. You don't get very many old buildings in that part of the world. The building of St Paul's was built in sandstone in an older style. It's got a spire, like it was built 200 years previously. What is the reason for that? Aesthetics. People like the look of it. There's no practical sense building a church out of sandstone next to a river where it's going to be eroded, and it's caused problems. We've had to have large sections of it replaced. Of course, we replaced it with more sandstone for the look of it. So it's interesting that there's that practical side of it. But with modern materials, am I right in thinking, no, maybe you know more about this, I don't know about it that much, is the modern materials that are used, they are cheaper to put up. You say that you can get clean lines on them, but they don't last as long. That's my impression. Or is that just using cheap materials? I'm not sure.
I think it may be. In hot countries, Mediterranean countries, I do know that they don't have carpets, for example, lining their houses.
Yes.
They have sort of marble and kind of materials that are made from marble, like little marble chips that are stuck together, so they're easily washable, and I love those.
Yes. Well, I imagine that's quite silly. So it gives a very different look. So it's partly where we live, it's partly the climate that changes how we look. But going for a traditional look is interesting from Charles, when the look is different, and when there's practical considerations as well, go back to traditions. But the other changes you talk about aren't necessarily traditional. They're part of a subculture, homeopathy, for example, and organic farming, going back to basics and farming. These are all things which have been against the mainstream, but some of them have come to fruition. The rest of the world's caught up with him. It seems like he was ahead of his time, and for someone who's not regarded as a great intellect, just in the general view of Prince Charles, wasn't that bright.
Well, he didn't get a lot of
qualifications.
No, that's right.
But in terms of his thinking through these issues, it does, well, at least it seems that he's been doing some thinking. Do you think that this is going to mark the age, that the Carolean age, or is he going to be more of a bystander and just be signing different acts of parliament at place and opening shopping centres. I mean, is that going to be his life, or do you think he's going to have more of an influence?
I think it will be his life, because he has promised that he cannot maintain the style of being critical,
the activism,
to his reign, because it doesn't serve him as a monarch particularly well. But I think it'll be interesting, certainly. Another thing that he particularly championed was cheese.
Cheese, yes. I'm a big fan of cheese. I like cheese a lot.
I'm a big fan of cheese. I don't like, what shall we say, mild cheese.
No, good strong cheese.
I like a good strong cheese. And apparently, of late, the health experts have said that cheese is good for us.
Yes.
Taken in moderation, but it is good for us because it does contain vitamin D, and apparently that is the one vitamin that the British are lacking.
Yeah, well, vitamin D is a big problem because the human bodies tend to make it when they're in sunlight, and we don't get anywhere near enough sunlight.
We're in the north of England here.
Even if you walked around naked all year, you wouldn't get enough Britain, I don't think. I think you need dietary input as well. Had people been taking more vitamin D, they would have been able to cope better with things like catching COVID, for example. It is rather vital for your immune system. So, yeah, that's a good point. Eat more cheese. Thank you, King Charles, for your advice. Yeah.
And one of our predominant British cheeses is cheddar, which I love.
Yes, a good strong cheddar. Yes, I'm getting hungry now. We better move on. I'm getting hungry now. But yes, we're cautiously optimistic of the King Charles's reign. So we're looking for a good Carolean era. Yeah, that's the summary.
Perhaps he might even manage to cut our taxes by living more frugally.
He has talked, just finally, I think we should say he has talked about a slimmed down monarchy, and that does reduce quite a bit of cost from the Treasury, doesn't it? Because they're paying now. The history of it is, of course, the king used to pay most of the activity of government, going back a few hundred years, to the first King Charles. You would have had the king having to pay for everything, like all the ambassadors, and all this would have been paid for by the king. Now, when it came to King Charles II, the restoration of the monarchy, again, the king was expected to pay for things, but they changed it such that he got a grant from Parliament for doing it, so they had some sort of control over it. But he was still paying for everything for some time, and I mean, it was really the quality of the people who were king. They was just wasteful.
Yes.
And so, in the end, the Parliament had to take it back. So now the responsibility for paying for things like ambassadors, etc., is directly from Parliament, and the king just gets grant for things like, what members of the royal family are actually being active, and the expenses to do with that. And so if he's going to slim that down, quite a few salaries and things that he's going to reduce.
Queen Consort Camilla will do without ladies in waiting. Not that they were paid, though. Ladies in waiting were not paid. They were expected to maintain themselves in their work as ladies in waiting. But apparently they will no longer be needed. Will Charles be able to do without his equerries, though?
Yeah, that could be tough. Tough change, having to put his own toothpaste on his toothbrush.
Blow his own nose.
And blow his own, yeah. I mean, I think this could be difficult for. It could be tricky.
And crack his own eggs.
Yeah, well, steady. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see that. I don't know how many of these stories are true, how much was done for Charles. Or maybe that is a difference from the Queen, as we were talking earlier. The people talk about staying with the Queen in Balmoral, and one of the things that's noted is that she did the washing up.
Ah, that was when they were out on picnics. Did she normally do the washing up?
Not for big...
no.
But not for big meals in the banqueting hall. But that's still interesting, isn't it?
Yes,
that they would do that. That she would step in and do that. And so, would King Charles do the washing up? I wonder. We don't know. Maybe he does.
I think if he did, we would be sure to have the media there.
Yeah. King Charles washing up. Anyway, we're strayed away from our serious predictions of what it's going to be like in the Carolean age, and we're positive. We think it's going to be a quiet time and he's not going to rock the boat. But possibilities of him putting pressure for the policies, for the things he was interested in. Actually, there were quite good things he was interested in, so a bit of pressure wouldn't be a bad thing.